Hello and welcome, Alcha, to Random Thoughts from County Antrim, and I'm your host, David McDonnell. This is Sunday, October 18. Who's to believe how fast this month of October is going? It does seem that time flies when you're in a pandemic, perhaps, to some. Now, I may have some new viewers today, and that's because of two recent feature articles. One was in Traverse Magazine. It's a monthly magazine that services most of northern Michigan. It's a wonderful magazine. And I say that even before September. And the reason I'm focusing on September is they ran a feature article on me. It's quite nice, actually. Included a full-length photo. And it was wonderful because I'm so photogenic. But that's what they chose to do. And that was in September. And then last week, the Traverse Record Eagle, which is the local newspaper for Traverse City, it's one of the few daily newspapers left in northern Michigan, maybe the only for that matter. They ran a feature on me during the week. And I thought that was wonderful, very gratifying. Not so much for me personally, but for storytellers generally. It's just, I'm past the age when I get excited about things like that. It just doesn't do a lot for me on a personal level. But to run a feature on a storyteller was very gratifying for the art of storytelling. For thousands of years, storytelling was a major form of entertainment, and it was one of the primary ways of passing on history and lore for people. And it was true not only in the Celtic culture of Ireland and elsewhere, but it's true of many, many cultures. It's much, much harder today for storytellers to compete in the modern world because there's so many other forms of communication. And we've developed, sadly, this wee attention span where everything has to grab us in 2 or 3 seconds or less, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Otherwise, forget about it. You should also keep in mind, I think, that storytellers of a century ago, and certainly thousands of years ago, were dealing with an audience that was largely illiterate. So that stories were a way, oral stories were a way people learned about their history, their families, their folklore, their traditions, their culture. It was also a way to pass on, valuable lessons. And that's kind of what I try to do in some of my stories. I deal with primarily Irish American audiences when I go to Irish festivals and Irish pubs. I tell old yarns and I tell stories and I make up a lot of them as I go along. But I try to bury a little bit in there, either a lesson or, if not a lesson, a little bit about Irish history or Irish culture so that the audience, besides being hopefully entertained, learn a little bit about their ancestors and how they lived and how they thought. And I wouldn't call oral storytelling a dying art because there are many, many storytellers out there who are just brilliant, doing a wonderful job. And I learn from them. We steal from each other all the time. And they are just some brilliant storytellers. There's just not as many of us as there used to be. And so it is nice to see both a newspaper and a magazine feature a storyteller, even if it's me. Now, many of my stories, I got one planned for you today. Many of my stories are pure fancy. They're just things I just made up that make no sense or whatever. I just like stringing some words together sometimes. Many of them are actually true. I do a lot of historical stories. And by true, I mean they're verifiably and historically true. Others, like the one I'm about to tell you, it kind of falls in the category of a true legend. And by that I mean it's about real people, real times, and it may or may not have happened. Events may have not have happened exactly as told in the story, but they've been told and retold so often that has become accepted as true. So it's a true legend. Now, many of these stories contain lessons, and I told you about the lesson of Irish culture and history I try to put in my stories. But I've had some other lessons more recently. It's kind of hard to avoid when you're living in the middle of a pandemic, and we're coming on within a matter of days to a national election. It's kind of hard not to put a lesson in your stories. And a few weeks ago, for example, I told a true story of a virus which started in Haskell County, Kansas, in 1918 and spread from there around the world and killed millions of people. For some reason, which I actually explained in that podcast, became known as the Spanish flu, but it didn't have anything to do with the Spanish. But it became called the Spanish flu. And the lesson of that was quite obvious, that you can't blame people who first contracted a virus for its ultimate spread around the world. You can't blame the people of Kansas for the Spanish flu any more than you can blame the people of Wuhan who first contracted the coronavirus. A few weeks after that, I made up a fable, and it was about an Irish king whose territories were being invaded by the Vikings, and this king chose to ignore all the evidence of the invasion and thought it best to pretend it wasn't even happening. It made him look better, at least in his eyes and to his people's eyes, if they just pretended it didn't exist. And you can guess the object of that fable. I told a few more fables a couple of weeks ago. They were Aesop's fables. They were stories you had all heard, but Aesop's fables were stories, oral stories intended to teach a lesson, particularly a lesson to children. And fables for years after that, the Aesop's fables, were used to teach lessons to children. And I told a few of those that just kind of gave lessons that I learned, hopefully most of you learned as children, but there were lessons that some people, particularly people in high office in our country, have forgotten. So that's what storytellers do, and have been doing that for thousands of years. And for reasons which maybe I'll talk about in another podcast, it's the path I've chosen to take. So with that introduction, I thought I'd tell you a story about a man named Somhairle, and how he was a Celtic clan chief, and how he came to marry Raunhilda, a beautiful daughter of a Viking king. Now, Somhairle was from a clan that had once had a fairly vast territories that were under their control, under their domain. But they had lost a series of battles and over a generation or two, and their domain shrunk considerably, and that caused, obviously, the people in the clan to either be subjugated to others or lived on their own in poverty. In fact, Somhairle's father, who was the clan chief, was living in a cave, hiding from the victors in the last battle. And the clans that were had been under their domain, knew they had to get a new chief. They needed new leadership in order to expand, in order to get back some of the lands they had. And after much discussion, they chose Somhairle, which was kind of an odd choice because he was not known as a particularly ambitious lad. He was sometimes thought of as lazy. He was more interested in fishing than anything else. But in one of the battles, one of the last battles fought before this point, he led a wing of the army that did quite well. It was the only wing of the army that did well, and the battle was a crushing defeat for the clan. So the elders of the clan decided they would they would approach Somhairle and see if he would be willing to lead the clan. And Somhairle wasn't even at this meeting. He was out fishing. And the elders went looking for them, and they found him fishing in a pond. And they told Sorla their dilemma, and that they had chose him to lead the clan, and asked him if he would do so. And Sorla said to them, "There is a salmon in that pool, and if I catch him, then I will accept your offer and lead the clan." And so he caught the fish and became leader of the clan. There's a long history about Sorla. He's one of the greatest figures in terms of stories and exploits over the next several decades. But at this point, he was still a young man. And among other things, as he began to lead his clan into some opportunities to expand the territories of the clan and add prosperity to members of the clan, he also was looking for a bride. He was unmarried at the time. And the areas he lived on, the island of Islay. Islay's in the Hebrides Islands. It's the islands between Ireland and Scotland. Islay is most famous today as because of a distillery there. It's a maker of some of the finest, maybe the finest Scotch, of one of the best whiskeys anywhere. But then it was a fairly small, remote island, and his clan still had some control over the other islands, and there were other spots in Scotland and Ireland that were controlled either by Irish clans or Scottish clans. The English were making inroads in Scotland at the time, as were the Vikings. The Vikings came to the British Isles initially as invaders and raiders. They would come in, plunder, grab their booty, and then go back to what is now Norway, or Denmark for that matter. But eventually the Danes and the Norse established settlements, and there were times of peace and times of war with these settlements around, in Scotland in particular. But during times of peace, the Celts and the Vikings lived together and traded with each other. And it was one of those trading expeditions that the king of the Norse, who lived in his kingdom, was some of the northern areas of what is now Scotland, sailed in his ship and landed in Islay. And he was there on a trading expedition. He wanted some of the goods. Maybe he wanted the Scotch whiskey, I don't know. But he wanted some of the goods that Sorla and his clan had. And he had some other goods that he was willing to trade for them. And this king was named King Olaf. And King Olaf, on this particular expedition, brought his daughter. His daughter was Raunhilda, a beautiful young woman. And it was quick after Sorla had some polite conversations with her that she was witty and smart and of course beautiful, and Sorla was smitten. He knew right then this is the woman he wanted to marry. And Olaf and his entourage, including Raunhilda, spent a few days in Islay, and they're getting ready to leave, and Sorla got together all of his courage, and he went up to approach Olaf, and he asked Olaf, he said to Olaf, "Olaf, I'm in love with your daughter, and I want to marry her. And I promise you I will take care of her, and I will be a good husband for her." And Olaf looked at Sorla, and he said, "No, you cannot marry my daughter. End of discussion." And Olaf went back to his ship with Raunhilda with him and his entourage, and sailed away back to his home in northern Scotland. Now, why he said no, we may never know, but he just decided in his own mind, in his own heart perhaps, that Sorla was not the man he wanted his daughter to marry. Sorla was quite distraught at this. He was dismayed and quite depressed, because he really did want to marry Raunhilda. She wasn't a prize. She wasn't something he needed for any reason other than the fact that he loved her. And one day, shortly after this, he consoled with his good friend, Morris McNeill. And he told all of this to McNeill, and he confided in McNeill. And McNeill said to him, "Sorla, do not worry. The next time Olaf comes to Isla, I will make sure that he grants his consent for you to marry Raunhilda." There was a little bit of comfort for Sorla, but it was the best he could do. And then sure enough, weeks later, months later, Olaf returns to Isla. Raunhilda was not with him, but he had a ship with men and goods ready to trade. And trade he did with Sorla and the men of Isla. Now, while Olaf was in Isla, the McNeill approached him, and he said, "King Olaf, I'm a wonderful sailor, and I would love to sail with you and your crew to wherever it is you go. And I promise you I will be loyal and dutiful, and I will obey your every command. And I promise you that if anything should happen to your ship while I am on board, I will go down with the ship." Now, Olaf was impressed with this comment by McNeill, and in fact was in need of a crew member or two. So he told McNeill, "Yes, I will hire you. You will be one of the crew of my ship." Now, on the night before Olaf had finished his trading and was about to set sail back to his home, McNeill snuck aboard the ship. And he had with him a drill. Now, it's not the cordless power drills that we use today. It's the old-fashioned drill where you'd stick it in and crank it around and drill a hole. So he had his drill. He also had a satchel. And in the satchel was a gooey kind of substance. It was a mixture of fat and suet. And while no one was looking, when he was the only one on the ship, McNeill went to a spot in the ship below the waterline and drilled a hole. And then quickly took the goo out of his satchel and plugged the hole with this suet and fat. And then he did another hole. He did the same thing. Plugged it with the suet. And another hole, and another hole, till he had several holes in the ship that belonged to King Olaf, each of which was plugged with a combination of fat and suet. Now, the next day, Olaf was ready to leave. He loaded up the goods that he had just traded with the men of Isla. His crew got on board, McNeill got on board, King Olaf got on board, and they set sail. Now, before they left, the McNeill told Sorla, he says, "Give us a several-hour, half-a-day head start. And after we have left, and you've given us that head start, you should follow with your own ship. Follow the same course. Just be a half a day behind us." Now, Olaf and his ship set sail. They were heading north around the coast of Scotland, heading for King Olaf's domain, his castle. And as they're traveling, that substance of fat and goo became a little more gushy as the salt water and the waves hit the side of the boat, both sides of the boat. It all made that substance even gooier, squishier, and water began to seep through. And as the men on King Olaf's ship were sailing, they began to notice there was water at the bottom of the boat. And as they kept sailing, they noticed the water was now up to their ankles. And they kept sailing more, although they were getting heavier, which means they were getting slower. And now the water was up halfway to their knees. And they pulled on the sails because they were going too slow anyway, and they spent all of their time trying to bail out the water as fast as they could. But they couldn't bail it out fast enough. And it wasn't long before the water in the boat was up to their knees. And now they're getting worried, because as fast as they were bailing out the boat, more water was coming in, and the water level was rising and rising. And they knew, or believed, they were doomed. And it was about that time they could see on the horizon, coming back from the direction which they had came. They saw a ship coming from the horizon. And they began to wave to make sure the people in the ship could see them. And as that other ship got closer, they started to yell, "Help, help, help." And as the ship got closer, they realized it was the ship that belonged to Sorla. And they could actually see that Sorla was on board. So as he got closer and closer, they started to yell, "Sorla, help us, help us." And Olaf himself got in the back, the stern of the boat, and yelled, "Sorla, we need your help. Our boat is sinking. Will you help us?" And as Sorla got closer and closer, Sorla yelled to him, "You've asked me to help? My answer is no." And despite that, King Olaf continued to plead, "You must help us. Our boat is sinking. We're all going to die. We need your help." And it was at that point that the McNeil came over to King Olaf and said, "He will not help you. Not unless you promise him that you will allow him to marry your daughter, Raunhilda." And Olaf thought, he says, "I already said, no, I'm not going to allow him to marry my daughter. But on the other hand, this boat is about ready to sink. I guess I have no choice." So he yelled out to Sorla, "Sorla, if you save us, I promise you, you may marry my daughter, Raunhilda." Now with that, Olaf brought his ship right alongside the sinking Viking ship. And one by one, the Vikings got off their ship and on board Sorla's ship. And as much as they could salvage, they took some of their goods that were on that ship and brought it on the Sorla ship. And King Olaf was one of those who got off his ship and onto Sorla's ship. Now the last man on the Viking ship was McNeil. And King Olaf said to him, "Come on, come on, come on, we're saved. You join us. I've been rescued. Come on board our ship." McNeil said, "No, I promised you that if anything should happen to the ship, I would go down with the ship. So I'm staying here. You go on." Now Olaf was reluctant, as was Sorla, to leave McNeil alone on a sinking ship, but they understood his honor, and so they left. Sorla and his ship, with Olaf on board, sailed to Olaf's castle. There he saw again Raunhilda, and he married her. And that's the story of how Sorla was able to marry Raunhilda. Now, Sorla was to become one of the most powerful clan chiefs in all of the Celtic world. His domain included much of western Scotland, most of the Hebrides Islands in between, and the northeast corner of Ireland as well. Now, he had a grandson. He and Raunhilda had a large family, and included in there was a grandson who was named Donald. And Donald became head of the clan. at some point in his life, and by that time the clan had this vast domain. The head of the clan was known as the Lord of the Isles, because their domain was the coastal regions of Scotland, Ireland, and all the islands in between. And the clan became known as Clandonnell. Actually, I got a book. You know what? I got a book about that, which is right behind my shoulder. And it was about the time, Donald's era was about the time that people started to adopt last names, and most people in the Celtic world adopted a last name that was the name of their clan. So those folks that were in Clandonnell adopted as their last name McDonnell, son of Donald. And it's spelled this way in some parts of the Celtic world. It was spelled most often, actually many ways, but the most common way is spelled with a D ending. You may know that from old McDonnell, who had a farm, or you may know that from the McDonnell brothers in Southern California, who sort of invented the fast food business. But that's their grandparents, actually, of Donald. That original Donald was Somhairle and Raunhilda. And now you know the story of how they got together and became a couple. Now, you may, that's the story, actually, of Somhairle and Raunhilda, and sometimes I end it there, but that's really not the story. It's not the whole story. The whole story, and excuse me for a little cup here, this is coffee, it's not Bushmills. I wish it was Bushmills, but it's not. You may ask yourself about the McNeil. What happened to him? He gave his life, you would think, for his good friend Somhairle. But did he? See, McNeil is the one who drilled the holes. He knew where they all were. And I told you of his satchel, which he had filled initially with fat and suet to plug the holes. But he also had in that satchel, excuse me, as after he drilled a hole, he had a plug for each hole, which he put in his satchel. And after Somhairle and Olaf sailed away, McNeil quickly went to each hole, pulled out the plug from his satchel, and plugged the hole. And within a few minutes, he had every one of the holes plugged. Now that meant no more water was coming in. Then he spent hours bailing out the ship, which was a little easier since new water was coming in. He was getting rid of the water that was already there. And after hours and hours of doing that, he completely bailed out the ship. It was as dry as the interior of a ship could be. And then he sailed back to his home on Islay. So you think it's a story about Somhairle and Raunhilda, but it's actually the story of the McNeil, who through his own cleverness became the proud owner of a Viking warship. So that's the story. It's one of those stories, as I said, is sort of a true legend. And it's one of my many stories. I'm glad I was able to tell that, because I used to tell that story a lot, and I haven't told it in quite some time. For who knows what reason, but I just haven't told it in a while, and I was afraid I was going to forget it. But fortunately, I remembered the story, at least enough of it to fill up this podcast. So let me tell you about my website for you new viewers out there. I've told this to some of the prior viewers. But my website is under reconstruction, and it's going to come out, I think, hopefully this week, maybe at the latest the week after. And I've looked at the prototypes and the private viewings before it goes entirely online, and I think you'll like it. I know I will. But if you want to look at my old podcast, you can't get them from my existing website. I just haven't been able to update it, that website, for some time. You can go to my website, clandonnell.net, now, and you can find links to my podcast through the end of August. Once the new website's online, you'll be able to go up to the minute, look at any of my podcasts. In the meantime, as I mentioned in a prior podcast, go to YouTube, type in Clandonnell in the search term, or type in Random Thoughts from County Antrim in the search term, and my old podcast will pop up. You may have to scroll down a little bit, but you'll find them. Or go to Facebook, type in Clandonnell on the search terms, and that'll get you to my Facebook page, and you can scroll down. You can see my old podcast there as well. But when the new website is online, you'll see them all there quite easily, and there'll be no excuse but to go back and look at all of my podcasts. In the meantime, send me an email, or anytime send me an email. I love them, and I love responding to people. I just had somebody just lick my hand here, and I have to be a dog of mine who snuck down here and tried to interrupt my podcast. But send me an email at clandonnell@gmail.net. Love to receive it, and I will, I promise, respond. Like and share my Facebook page, and continue to enjoy a good story, whether it's told by me or anyone else. So until next time, goodbye and shlon.